Hey everyone, it's time to continue our coverage of the Spectre's history. If you get confused at any time, well, you've probably not seen all the preceding videos to this, so just click on the button up at the top of the screen there, and it'll help you out. Otherwise, enjoy the show. In the wake of the crisis of infinite Earths, and the war between heaven and hell, the Spectre had failed to prevent the chaos surrounding these events, leading other heroes to step in. This did not please the creator of the Spectre, an entity called the Presence. It had already been questioning the value of the being, and had previously punished it a few times back when it was still operating on Earth 2. As such, the Spectre was rendered as dead, or perhaps at least as much of a death as a being like it could experience at the time. He was rendered dormant, and his body was transported to a realm where it could sit inactive, even though the Spectre never truly lived to begin with. In this realm, it is possible the Spectre was existing in his natural form and size as a cosmic entity. It would fit well with the scale of the Spectre's true power as we know it. Yet even so, that scale is very difficult to consider. For example, at this time, the Spectre's eyes were 23 light years apart. As for the newly created amalgamated Earth born out of the crisis, Jim Corrigan was still considered missing in action, unofficially having disappeared during some undercover work. One of his friends, a detective Lou Petrocchi, decided to quietly look into the matter when the police refused to pursue these events further. While this was happening, the Presence reached out to the Spectre. It acknowledged that the Spectre's punishment as it stood made him useless, and wasn't entirely fair either. Paradoxically, the Spectre was so powerful, it was difficult to make use of that power without destroying the vast swaths of the cosmos he was supposed to protect. It decided to change the form of this punishment and cast him out from this unknowable realm. The Presence spoke of the Spectre's role thus far, providing a lot of context for his actions up to and beyond the crisis of infinite Earths. The Spectre was to become an agent to aid in the passage of spirits into heaven and hell, but mostly as a vessel of vengeance for souls killed before they were intended to die. Spirits born through murder and trauma must be avenged, or they will just suffer on Earth for all eternity. This seems to largely have been the purpose of the Spectre to begin with, but he often inflicted a disproportionate and inconsistent amount of wrath on criminals during his existence, perhaps as he was navigating concerns around human standards and conflict, especially with the Earth 2 version of Jim Corrigan, who was a lot more deferential to due process and increasingly fought with the Spectre while they were bonded. So the Spectre would return, but with two conditions. One, it could only punish those who truly and actually deserved it. And two, his wrath must be worthy of the crimes committed, such that only the truly vile would suffer. With that, the spirit was returned to life, as it were, though his powers were heavily pared down, making him only the most powerful ghost on Earth. That's still a considerable level of power, certainly, but a far cry from the being that went toe-to-toe with the Anti-Monitor, or the embodiment of evil itself. In both cases, largely able to stand his ground against beings, even if he ultimately failed against both entities. The Spectre was then sent to Earth in a vortex of screaming souls that died during the war against the darkness and the Anti-Monitor, towards the body of Jim Corrigan. The final aspect of this new punishment would leave the Spectre spiritually tethered to this mortal on a level not seen before. And with that, on the new Earth, the Spectre was reborn. He woke in the home of Madame Xanadu, a powerful and benevolent fortune-teller living in New York, who managed to procure Jim Corrigan's body just before the resurrection. Xanadu was assisted by Kim Liang, a young woman who was co-opted into the fortune-teller's service. Her presence caused the Spectre to immediately spring forth from Corrigan, and the separation caused Jim Corrigan a great deal of pain, unlike before. While the Spectre barked out an ambiguous warning at Kim, Madame Xanadu explained that the pain was going to happen now that the bond between the Spectre and Jim Corrigan had changed in nature. The Spectre leaving their shared body would always make Jim Corrigan weaker. However, the pain over time would subside. Xanadu seemed to know the Spectre well and explained Kim would be their new assistant, prompting the spirit to calm down and return to Jim Corrigan's body. Corrigan collected Kim's unconscious body after she fainted due to all of this supernatural business being quite new to her, and Madame Xanadu led them to Jim's new office where he could work as a private detective, with Xanadu having even set him up with a legal license to do so. All of this was arranged by the fortune teller herself, though she insisted her help for these two would largely be more spiritual in nature as a sort of guide. Now set up with a new life, at first Jim Corrigan struggled to adapt to this new occupation as a private detective. This is true even though this is an amalgamated Jim Corrigan, combined of various versions of the Jim Corrigans that once existed across the multiverse. And as such, his personality had changed quite a bit into one more thoughtful, but also quirky. It was made worse by business being slow immediately upon his return. With him being a changed man recently returned to life, few connections surviving his disappearance, all Corrigan could really do was rely on advertising in the yellow pages and hoping people would just show up in his office. Meanwhile, the man became more haunted with nightmares and visions, even hearing sounds of scratching from inside the walls of Madame Xanadu's home. Pretty soon, the Spectre discovered that, now reduced in power, he could no longer possess living things, only inanimate objects or those who have passed away. As before, when separated for long periods of time, the Spectre would grow weaker, but with their increased bond, the terms of this were much more explicit and severe. Now, not only would separation affect Corrigan, but if they did so for longer than 2 days, Jim would die for good, and the Spectre would apparently disintegrate into nothing. Kim Liang was explicitly recruited and mentally prepared through Xanadu's magic to be the guard who would look over Jim Corrigan's body when separated, protecting it if he lost consciousness, and thus the Spectre in the process. Hence the spirit's interest in her when they first met, and her relative ability to take the supernatural events around her in stride, in spite of her initially fainting. Of course, so many changes altered the nature of the relationship between Spectre and his host, which became much more personable as the Spectre had to address to existence and much more resembled a mortal being like Corrigan. Though a power struggle remained between the two parties, the dynamic behind it changed quite a bit. Both parties needed each other, but were perfectly able to operate on their own. The Spectre could very much come and go as he pleased without Corrigan having much control over it, but Corrigan could do whatever he wanted without the Spectre being able to stop him. This led to the two fighting, based on a conflict that had already been brewing in the years leading up to the crisis between the Spectre and the past versions of Jim Corrigan. Interestingly, for the first time, this version of Corrigan also brought up concern of how they were treating these criminals. He started arguing about the justice in punishing those who were often as much victims as those they killed, especially when people were possessed by supernatural entities. This only served to offend the spirit, leading to a prolonged fight where the two didn't even speak to each other for a while. Worse still, the contentious relationship put both in danger, as it spurred Corrigan to often investigate cases on his own when the Spectre was recharging or absent, which left both of them very vulnerable. If Corrigan were to have ever died during this time, it could have meant the permanent end of the Spectre. Meanwhile, a cabal of Satanists known as the Cult of the Blood Red Moon detected the resurrection and knew this presented them with an opportunity. They arranged for the capture of Lou Petrocchi, Jim's friend, who was possessed by an imp that began forcing the detective to kill various targets on behalf of the cult, who in turn worshipped the demonic being. The Spectre caught wind of this and began tracking the detective down, while Corrigan became involved with a murder when a woman connected to the cult was killed by a giant eagle that burst into his own office and ripped the young lady's heart out. This was considered extremely suspicious to the police, given Jim's earlier disappearance, and he was left a prime suspect, until another similar murder gave the police the sense something bigger was going on. Jim and the Spectre eventually worked together and discovered that these crimes were all linked and part of a massive plan on behalf of the cult. Corrigan wanted to help his friend Lou, but the Spectre had deduced the cult was aiming to bond Lou with the imp in such a way that they would become a symbiotic being that would exist as a sort of evil counterpart to the Spectre and Corrigan, and in the creation of this being would have killed the heroes in the process. So the Spectre, in spite of Jim's protests, managed to track down and kill Lou before he bonded with the imp, but had to let the demonic being and the cult escape in order to save Corrigan from a bunch of strange monsters that had been quietly smuggled into his office by the cult, who disguised the monsters' eggs as gumballs, and they eventually grew into the walls, hence all the scratching noises he heard earlier. Corrigan actually witnessed these monsters earlier, but failed to warn the Spectre due to being distracted by the whole incident with the giant eagle. This made the ghostly being furious, punching out the former detective. When Liang tried to help her employer, Jim made a move towards her, leading them to kiss. A romance soon developed between the PI and his assistant, with both bonding over having been used by supernatural entities and rendered implacable in the face of events no matter how terrifying or dangerous they may be. This then spurred the couple to ask Madame Xanadu why she recruited Kim to begin with, and went to such great efforts to help the Spectre on an ongoing basis. The fortune teller explained that the changes to the spirit could make him become more dangerous, and she wanted to serve as a guide to keep his more violent instincts under control. And so, under this new dynamic, the group began tracking down killers and other supernatural threats. The first case after the cult involved successfully stopping the Liqueur killer, a serial murderer who targeted young women and decorated their corpses in clown makeup. Following that case, memories began to stir of events leading up to Corrigan's disappearance, death, and the storage of his body in a strange vase that kept it preserved until the Spectre's return. After some research into red mist that was killing people in New York, Xanadu revealed that in the final days of the crisis, a woman named Gina killed Corrigan after she was possessed by the red mist. The fortune teller had Corrigan's body quietly sealed away after that happened, knowing it would be important again in the future, assuming the crisis of Infinite Earths didn't destroy all of reality. This led to the discovery that the red mist was another spirit, though much more malevolent than the Spectre, as it was fueled by the cataclysmic energies from the crisis of Infinite Earths. The mist soon found itself in conflict with the Spectre, but fled the being and trapped the spirit by attempting to knock down a building in New York. The Spectre was forced to hold it up while the red mist got away, slaughtering dozens in the tunnels underneath the city to further empower itself against one so strong as the Spectre. Corrigan was forced to rescue the Spectre by finding him underground, and the spirit was freed while the building above was successfully evacuated, and the restored Spectre even managed to keep it intact. After much work, it was eventually discovered that the red mist was the ghost of a man named Enrique Armas. With the truth now in the open and the help of the phantom stranger, Gina and Enrique's spirits were able to peacefully move on. Corrigan was left to deal with this information, finding hollow comfort in learning the details of his death. Though he managed to once again avenge his own death in yet another reality and timeline, it turns out Swamp Thing was right about the results of the war between heaven and hell. Nothing would ever be simple again for this superhero.